So if I were you, I'd go ahead and have your review out because there might be some people or events that are connected to the review. So we're looking at guerrilla style warfare. Remember that a lot of the guerrilla style warfare was civil war within the Civil War because a lot of these guerrillas operated along the borders of the border states. So, for example, a lot of guerrilla warfare activity out in Missouri, guerrilla warfare on the borders of Kentucky and Ohio, a great deal of guerrilla warfare on the border of Virginia and what was now West Virginia. These folks are sort of characterized or categorized in different groups. So the most well-respected group would be partisans. Partisans were actually received rank. So, for example, in the Shenandoah Valley, John and Bowdoin and John Singleton Mosby were two partisans who rose to the rank of colonel. They did a little bit of everything. They served as intelligence. They disrupted Union supply. A lot of their rangers were disguised as everyday civilians or disguised as Union soldiers. These folks also tended to the farms during the day in the Shenandoah Valley and rode and fought at night or served in some capacity for that region that they represented. Most of the partisan rangers, like Mosby's Rangers or in Bowdoin's partisans, they worked out of the area that they knew and grew up in. So they also technically served as spies as well. The next group that I want to highlight is a group called the Home Guard. Home Guard would be people that would have worked just in a particular county or a particular town or an area that they knew and they would have assisted. Not all Home Guard was really trusted. It really kind of depended on who they were with, who they were connected with. You also have groups that are just known as scouts. Scouts would have been sometimes well represented by a commander. Some scouts, like Robert E. Lee, hated scouts. He saw them as sort of like, I don't know, kind of like crafty and a bit disloyal and dishonest because scouts were working for money. They weren't enlisted in the military. Another group here that I want to point out is a group called the Signal Corps. These folks were obviously trying to send and intercept information. If you're ever going through the Shenandoah Valley, there's a mountain that you can see. It's called Lookout, or it's called Spy Mountain. Up pretty much between Stanton and Lexington, almost halfway in between, and that was an area in which Confederate Signal Corps worked out of throughout the war. And then the group that was not really respected and were actually hated by both the Union and the Confederacy were known as bushwhackers. So the bushwhackers, there were bushwhackers everywhere, but the largest and most recognized group of bushwhackers were out in Missouri. They were led by William Quantrill, Bloody Bill Anderson, and those guys, they wreaked havoc, not just on Union military forces, but they also wreaked havoc on the civilian population, and that was sort of contradictory to what the Confederacy was really trying to do, especially out in the West, because they're trying to gain more support from the general population. Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, they led two of the most infamous gangs in the post-Civil War era, and that was the Frank and Jesse James, and then the Younger brothers, Jim, John, Bob, Cole. Are y'all familiar with those gangs? They were bank robbers, train robbers, had these crazy heists in the post-Civil War era.
Yeah, I think a lot of foreign Confederate veterans go out west after the war.
For sure, yeah, that was actually a really big business, was to go out west after the war to try to find work, and a lot of them that didn't find work or couldn't find work made it as outlaws in the west. Some of them legitimately went out there to be outlaws because the opportunity was too good to pass up, because you still got gold and silver mines running, you've got railroad lines being built. You know, it's not just one transcontinental rail line that's going to be laid out. So to rob wagon trains, to rob trains, to rob other soldiers that are out there, railroad workers, and then there's other professions as well. People take advantage of the Homestead Act, try to go out and make it as farmers. People go out as buffalo hunters because buffalo hides were bringing a big cost back east. So there's a lot of different, there's other opportunity than just crime out west.
When you say outlaws, do you just mean like thievery, or do you mean like mercenary type of military type thing?
Both. I mean, it depends. I mean, you could have worked with a gang or a group of these guys, or you could have actually been a hired gun. But that's a good question. So here are two of the most well-respected partisans in Bowdoin and John Singleton Mosby. And Bowdoin is interred at Hollywood Cemetery. Mosby's actually a Powhatan native. Went to the University of Virginia, got kicked out for a guy challenged him to a duel. He ends up shooting the guy in the face. Gets kicked out of UVA. The guy didn't die. Gets kicked out of UVA, and then winds up just kind of being. He's sort of like a self-made. Sort of raises his own militia force and rises to the rank of colonel. He was known as the Gray Ghost of the Confederacy, and Mosby on the right there. And then these are two of the most notorious bushwhackers and seen as outright criminals, and that is William Quantrill on the left, Bloody Bill Anderson. Bloody Bill Anderson had this weird superstition, tradition, I don't know how you want to phrase it, but he kept a collection of ears in a satchel bag that he rode with in the saddle. These guys worked out of Missouri.
Why?
Intimidation.
I'm coming to rob you. Here's my bag of ears.
Yeah, I got a bag of ears.
I'm gonna add your ears.
Yeah, ears of those that the gang killed and severed.
That's gross. That's a new thing.
Yeah, it's pretty gross. All right, so let's look at a little bit of Confederate espionage. The Confederate spy network tried to work mostly out around Alexandria, Virginia, Leesburg, Virginia, in and around D.C. There were multiple spy rings that were set up. In fact, as early as 1861, the governor of Virginia, John Letcher, set up a spy ring that included agents like Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who we learned about before, gave the information to P.G.T. Beauregard of McDowell's movements on Bull Run. Thomas Jordan, who was a well-known and recognized spy. It's pretty funny, huh? Well-known and recognized spy in this particular ring set up by Letcher. Jordan worked in and around D.C., getting information to Confederate forces in Northern Virginia, and information being passed along through to Richmond. This is not just regional information. The information that they're trying to get from politicians, socialites, generals, etc., they're getting information not just on movements in the East, but also movements in the West as well. Greenhow and Thomas Jordan established what was known as the secret line. This was moving the intelligence across the Rappahannock. to Richmond. The Confederate Signal Corps, as I mentioned before, this was a group that not only passed communication, but also intercepted communication. What they mainly used was a lot of the Signal Corps used Morse code, but they also had other tactics than just being on a mountaintop with flags. Confederacy did have a Secret Service Bureau. The Secret Service, in what you think today, was not Secret Service of what it was in the American Civil War. Secret Service was a mixture of intelligence, anti-counterfeiting, and really just partisan work. Not protection for any president, not really a major security detail as we know the Secret Service today. I'll get to the question in a second. The Confederate Signal Corps was led by Samuel Norris. Again, they run some counter-espionage operations, and they try to establish networks in Washington as well, which would give them the most information. John Yates Beale, Confederate privateer, who was actually arrested as a spy in New York. He was arrested and executed, seen as a Confederate martyr. Two of the most famous women spies in the war, we talked about Rose O'Neal Greenhow, but another would be Belle Boyd, the Cleopatra of the secession, as she was known. She worked out of her family's hotel in Front Royal. She was one of the top spies for Stonewall Jackson in the Valley Campaign. She also did more than just espionage and moving information. She also moved vital supply and medicine like quinine and other important medication that the Confederates were running low on. She'll actually end up going on to London after the war. She acts in a number of plays that were sort of like autobiographical narratives. She ends up marrying a Union soldier, which is a little ironic, before it's all said and done. And then Thomas Jordan and Rose O'Neal Greenhow, they were in the Aaron Van Camp spy ring, and that was ultimately broken up by Alan Pinkerton. So that takes us to our Union spies and the Union spy ring, which is a little bit more decentralized. So we'll talk about that in a second. What was the question?
The secret line, how does this work? Is it like a series of drop boxes? Is it a human connection? How does it function?
It is. It's actually a combination of those. It's movement between a lot of different people. They're getting the information on the partisans, and those partisans and spies are getting them on to generals and governmental officials. So this particular spy ring had what we would consider kind of double agents who were believed to be Unionists that were part of Washington Socialite, like the Washington Socialites at this period of time. They weren't. They were actually Confederate sympathizers that were working on behalf of the Confederacy in Washington, D.C. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. What's that? Yeah, you could find, yeah, you could definitely, and these are a couple of people that would be cool to research too. Belle Boyd on the left and Rose O'Neal Greenhow on the right. Union espionage was kind of like every major general and even Abraham Lincoln, they kind of had their own spy network, but there is one guy that sort of overshadows all of these spies, and that is a Scottish-born detective by the name of Alan Pinkerton. As you guys, I know if you were with me last year, you learned about the Pinkerton Agency. We talked about Pinkerton Security. Did you guys learn about the Pinkertons last year? You weren't with me? Alan Pinkerton started his detective work in really the first detective agency in the United States during the American Civil War. He served directly for McClellan and then ultimately Lincoln. And his network of spies and detectives worked not only for him, but also for other generals and other politicians and members of different parts of the Union military and Union Navy throughout the entire war. They became so powerful that they became this large detective agency that did more than just investigations. They were hired muscle. So if you, in the post-Civil War era, needed somebody to find information on a person, needed somebody to help you solve a murder, needed somebody to break somebody's kneecaps for you, the Pinkertons were a one-stop shop. They kind of did it all. So Pinkerton was extremely effective as this lead detective. Lafayette Baker worked directly for Winfield Scott. Abraham Lincoln had William Alvin Lloyd work as a spy for him. Lincoln also had, after he removed McClellan from command, Pinkerton worked directly with Lincoln as well. Grant's spy network was led by General Grenville Dodge, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but we've got, remember, two lines of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And Dodge ran the rail line that went from Omaha to Utah. He was in command of that in the post-war era. Colonel George Sharp created the Bureau of Military Information, aided by one of Pinkerton's guys, John C. Babcock. Pinkerton is technically the father of the Secret Service, if you really think about it. And the whole reason that the Secret Service was established in the first place, which I believe we talked about last week, was established for counterfeiting, right? And then it becomes a agency that we use to protect the President of the United States. The Union had a number of female spies: Pauline Cushman, Harriet Tubman, who we've talked about in the past, Elizabeth Van Lew here in Richmond. Elizabeth Van Lew had a very interesting spy network, and I don't know if you've ever heard of her before. She was pretty high up in the social structure of Richmond at the time, and she had a house slave that she hired out to work in the White House of the Confederacy with as a paid servant. I don't know if you realize this, maybe you do, but a lot of times slaves were hired out to do labor all throughout Richmond during the war. So Tredegar Iron Works, most of the labor force that was working at Tredegar were actually free African Americans or slaves that were hired out by their owners. Question? They would return back home. And this is an interesting thing too. A lot of that gives, prior to the Civil War, if you're wondering, and we haven't gotten there yet, Richmond had a very large free black population. The reason a lot of urban centers did have free black populations is because they were able to work, earn their own wages, and then buy their freedom. Where in the deeper South or in the rural South, you didn't have that opportunity unless you were like a pretty skilled artisan, right? And I'll get back to Van Lew in a second. What's your question?
The point of the book I was reading, the Senate members of the Committee on the Conduct of War met to consider charges of treason against Abraham Lincoln's wife. Apparently she had 4 brothers that were in the Confederacy.
You were correct.
So there was some
Yeah.
suspicion against Confederate sympathy.
Yeah, she did. And so did another very famous family that, that's a really good book, that guy's birthday is incredible. Civil War author. Another family that had that same problem too was Henry Clay's family. Like half the family was fighting the Confederacy, half fighting. Good point there. Glad you brought that up. So Van Lew hires out this servant, but the servant ends up, she's not a slave. Van Lew's freed her. She actually can read and write. So she's bringing intelligence out of the White House of the Confederacy to Van Lew. Van Lew's then moving that intelligence to the Union generals. Union generals are getting that intelligence to the Pinkertons and then on to Lincoln. So that was that's kind of like a flip side spy network. Elizabeth Van Lew was so hated in Richmond that no one attended her funeral after she died. So this was kind of like this was sort of an interesting piece of not just Civil War history, but local Virginia history. And if we have the opportunity, I'm going to show you guys where Elizabeth Van Lew's house is in Richmond. It's been turned into a school in Churchill now. Kate Warren, she was part of the Pinkerton network. Sarah Emma Edmonds, she actually served as a soldier in the war. This was not common, but it happened where women actually came in to serve as soldiers. We'll talk a little bit about that later. One group that is really important to talk about that I don't want to leave out are African American slaves, free African Americans, and smugglers that served as black dispatches. We talked a bit about them before. There's one guy in particular that I want to mention. His name is Robert Smalls. He was a smuggler and a spy who actually captured a Confederate ship and got it and turned it over to the Union. So that was one of those daring maneuvers that was led by an African American spy during the war as well. So here we have on the left Allan Pinkerton, Lincoln, John McNarland, who was one of Lincoln's close friends. He was a politician and general that had come out of Illinois. I think he's born in Kentucky like Lincoln, but had his political career, went back to Illinois. Civil War medicine. This is a bit of a gruesome topic. I do want you to keep in mind there's going to be a few images with medicine and prisoners of war that might be a bit disturbing, so just a heads up. Confederacy actually ran a bit of a more efficient medical operation throughout the war than the Union did. We're going to see that sort of, well, it's hard to see it up front, but it's easy to explain. How many people have been up to Chimborazo? Chimborazo was one of the largest military field hospitals in the history of warfare, period. That was the level of essentially what the Confederate medical surgeon general did was try to tap into the success of the Confederate ordnance, and they were very successful in taking advantage of that in Richmond. So imagine the Confederate large field hospital was in Chimborazo, just above Churchill in Richmond. Obviously, there are field hospitals outside of combat all over the American South. Anywhere a war is being fought, any place can be turned into a field hospital. And we'll talk a little bit about that moving forward. There's no ambulance corps at the beginning of the war, but by 1862, some of those larger battles that we talked about in the Peninsula Campaign and out in the Western Theater, we talked about Shiloh and Perryville and some of those big ones, that leads to an ambulance corps being established. Obviously, amputations became more commonplace. A lot of the tactics of triage, we're familiar with triage, determining like, all right, is this person going to live or die? Do we need to keep this arm or remove this arm? Do we need to keep this leg or remove this leg? That is all sort of established through the Crimean War surgical practices, and that both the Confederacy and the Union armies use that. Confederates are the first to use prosthetics. If you went to the Virginia Historical Society with me last year, you saw that example of prosthetics that were used in Richmond and Chimborazo. Chimborazo also should get credit for doing a couple of important things for medicine. Number one, this is the first time we start thinking about germ theory, where you say, oh, hey, if we move our latrines from where we're operating, or we move discarded arms, legs, and any limbs we have to amputate, and we clean up the blood, people are living longer, right? And then we can start using prosthetics. So germ theory is, we're not there yet, but people start thinking about this thanks to Chimborazo. Another really important thing that Chimborazo provides, this large field hospital, is this is the beginning of the American female nurse, all right? Obviously, females worked as nurses in both the Union and the Confederate armies, but we're talking about African American and white women, free African American women and slave women serving as nurses. Prior to the war, nurses, the field of nursing was not a profession dominated by women. After the Civil War and the Crimean War, it becomes a profession dominated by women. And it's tremendously important because these women are doing some important things like they're saving lives due to their cleanliness and their hygiene in medical practice. Their bedside manner is obviously helping soldiers and saving soldiers in a lot of these situations. So this becomes a really important event in American history, period. Question? Okay, cool. So both sides flew the yellow flag as a universal symbol that there was a hospital or some medical location to ensure there wouldn't be an attack. This, I think, is, in my opinion, like the most crazy statistic from the medical side of things. At the start of the war, there's 500 Union surgeons and 27 Confederate surgeons. At the end of the war, nearly 11,000 Union surgeons and nearly 3,000 Confederate surgeons. So it's quite a jump in the profession of medicine. And as sad as this may sound, Civil War, the Civil War is going to develop a lot of advancements in medicine because so many people are practicing medicine during this war. Here we have the yellow flag outside of a church to commemorate this church being used as a war hospital. This is a couple of surgeons' kits. If you went to the, did you guys, those of you that went to the Historical Society with me last year, did you guys notice the surgeon kits? So there's a couple of tools that are pretty funky here that I wanted to point out. And it's these hooks, right? Y'all know what those hooks are used for?
No, but it looks like the thing that's like shoved in your mouth.
They could use, they would probably have to have used something with a little bit more force to like open up your rib cage. It's actually used for if you are going to cut off a guy's arm, right? You're going to have to take those veins and you're going to gently pull those veins out, right? Pull the skin back, right? You're going to cut the veins. You're going to have to either tie the veins off or cauterize them, right? And then you're going to cut off the limb. And then if the vein is cauterized or if it's tied, you're going to sew it back. And then you're going to, hopefully the vein will come back together. So many times these strings would come loose or it wouldn't cauterize properly and the person would just bleed out. So that particular tool is used to pull these veins out to be able to be severed and cauterized.
Oh,
So
that's
they didn't have anesthetics then?
disgusting.
Yes,
Well, did they just
kind
give
of.
whiskey?
Didn't a lot of people
Yeah,
pass
I
out
mean,
on things?
if you had whiskey, that'd be great. But if you had ether, that'd be really great.
Actually,
Or if you had, it's like it would knock you out. But the problem too with the use of ether and other, you could kill you, right? Chloroform,
Oh.
knock you out, right? But do you really have that? Probably not. If you're on the field, you probably don't even have whiskey. That's that term, bite the bullet. You know, you're gonna bite down on a bullet, bite down on a stick, and they're just gonna go. They're gonna get after it and try to take it off. And these field surgeons get really fast. They get really good at their job as the war moves on. Really tough stuff. Yeah.
Actually, I know this is all treating, but I was in Illinois and they had like a battle doctor there.
Oh, cool.
Like, the first there, it was so fun. But he said whiskey would not avoid because it made blood thin.
Yes.
So the thing that, I mean, I'm sure someone who was somewhere was like, this sucks. Not
Yeah,
back.
that's a really good point too. Alcohol, they weren't always using alcohol because it would thin out your blood.
But it was also the thing that a lot of people just straight passed out from hanging out. Just like,
Yeah, pass out from shock. So we got some the standard medical training. I don't know why this is doing this, but that's fancy. Two 5-month semesters or 3 years, depending on the state. This is random. I didn't even know I put this. I didn't mean to, but whatever. Real nice. All right, so tuition was really often the only criteria for a diploma. So if you could pay for a diploma, you could get one. Everybody kind of served that had the stomach for it in the medical field during the war. Dentists, barbers, veterinarians, medical students. Medical college hired grave robbers to get cadavers, which was kind of an interesting problem that a lot of people had. Not a lot, but it was actually a business.
so you would say, hey, you don't dig up that many people.
That was a legit business for free African Americans in the pre-war era. Was grave robbers for the Medical College of Virginia.
I saw that thing in Britain where that you had to build a cage around so that they can.
Yeah, to try to protect.
How
Yeah.
did that ever
Well, you had like mausoleums and tombs. I mean, especially if you go to Hollywood Cemetery, there's a lot of mausoleums there. Just locally, obviously everywhere, but locally, we're talking like Civil War era. All right, so lawyers, politicians, wealthy citizens could purchase their surgeon's license. Similar breakdown for both armies: 1 regimental surgeon, 2 assistant regimental surgeons, contract surgeons throughout. Here are your surgeon generals. The surgeon general for the Union was William Alexander Hammond. Allowed surgeons to utilize any style of practice, established Carver Hospital in DC, used the European methodology of triage. General S.P. Moore established Chimborazo in Richmond. First to start looking at germ theory, used Confederate ordnance to his benefit throughout Richmond, had a talented group of advisors, Dr. James McCall, utilized the use of women, both white and black women were used as nurses during the war, first to do so on either side. What is going on here? I must have accidentally done some sort of animation. Whatever. All right, so causes of injuries, about 5% with cutting weapons, bayonets, 10% artillery, 85% musket projectile. So what are we talking about in terms of projectiles? Ball, buckshot and ball, Williams cleaners, shale, sectionals, Gardner explosive tips. These are all evolved off the mini ball, which we'll talk a bit about here momentarily. Disease obviously is a major killer in the war, is the major killer. Field stations were all over the front lines. Ambulance corps was used by 1862. So if you have you're looking at your amputation mortality rates, these are pretty high mortality rates, and the reason that the mortality rates are so high for 1 or 2 amputations is due to the susceptibility of disease, and there's one major killer, and that is gangrene. Gangrene typically led to the patient contracting pneumonia, and the pneumonia would typically kill the patient because they had contracted this disease due to their wounds. Due to the triage, head and chest wounds were expected to die. Did you all notice General John Gordon from Antietam, where he got hit in the face? He was like wounded 5 times, and he was like, "Yeah, I was just left to die. I would have died if I couldn't have spit the blood out of the hole that the bullet had caused." General Gordon was not expected to live. That's why the field doctors didn't tend to him. He made it, though. Kind of miraculous scenario. So here are your aid stations, pretty much all over the place. Houses, barns, cow stalls, pig pens, coal bins, churches, schools, boarding houses. Everything was used for field hospitals.
You stated they were starting to develop gunpowder. Did that ever?
It's going to be a post-war.
I mean,
Yeah.
but I mean, did the case where once they sort of had the idea of, hey, maybe if we move the bathrooms away from the medical field and the food, it'd be better. Do you think they ever started to migrate into cleaner spaces to people?
For sure. Chimborazo, hands down. Yeah, it's a good question. This is Union Ambulance Corps training. This is a makeshift field hospital. This picture's outside of Petersburg in 1864. This is a field doctor performing an amputation. Now that's a little bit grotesque. So let's take a look at the mini ball. All right. Captain Claude Monet is going to invent the .58 caliber mini ball. So what we're looking at is a cone-shaped bullet with grooves that could be rammed down a barrel that was rifled. So about 1.5 ounces of lead packaged in 60 grains of salt, pepper, and black powder placed in paper cartridge, very slow moving in trajectory. It would flatten out when it hit the victim. So typically what happens is if it hits your arm, rather than it like going through your arm, it just splinters your bone, and then your bone splinters into your muscle and into your arm, and then that creates a bigger problem for infection. So that's why so many of these, the crazy number of projectiles created a lot of the, what will ultimately lead to the disease. And there's other things to think about. And I know this sounds really weird, but like if you're carrying a cartridge box, and your cartridge box has your ammo, and it has your bullets in there, you might also have hog fat back in there, right? You might have that to grease up your bullets. I don't know if you all realize they use that, right? So then let's imagine you've got these mini ball or these lead balls, and they're greased up with fat back, and it's rancid fat back, and they're moving in a low, slow trajectory, and maybe that hasn't burned off. That's going to create a problem for disease. And there's a really great book. It's a chapter out of the book, and I'm probably going to pull the chapter for you. It's written by a professor at the University of Wyoming who just talks about the issue of insects and disease and how it was a devastating killer in the war. And he talks about that very problem with the cartridge boxes in this book. Yeah.
When it says slow movement, like what exactly do we mean by that?
I mean, like the trajectory of a mini ball would have been faster than a lead ball, but it's not as fast as what we see at the end of the war, like the Gatling gun or the breech loader or the carbine. Like it's not firing that at that. We're talking about like the Springfield, the Enfield, like those early rifle muskets. But those are like the most commonly used weapon throughout the war. So there are guys at the end of the war that are still using the 1861 Springfield. So that is still causing a similar problem.
why would that benefit is, I mean, I understand that they want to make it go something faster by increasing.
No, to make it easier for loading.
Okay,
Yeah.
but like, would it help with the grease friction?
Who knows?
Why was that their, like, main thing? Would it not make loading the gun greasy, or like, would it not mess with your hand and your grip?
Well, and then as the war goes on, you don't even have access to that.
It seems like a good thing that you're doing, but then when you do it, you're like, oh, I had a can full of rancid hog fat, and
Right.
now I can't grip properly, and I just died.
Yeah. And it wasn't used, obviously, by everyone. So you have an estimated 60,000 Union amputations. It's really hard to calculate the Confederate amputations. They weren't as well documented. There's Claude Monet. These are just some other versions of the mini ball. That's the Shaler sectional. That's the Gardner explosive tip. That's the Williams cleaner. So has anybody ever found any bullets before? Cool. It's awesome. So if you ever find any bullets, because chances are you'll probably find some. If you live in the Metro Richmond area, you know, you might come across some bullets at some point. It's worth doing a little research to see what you got. I've got some at the house, so I can bring some in for you guys to check out.
How did the explosive work between?
There you go. So this will answer the question, how does this work? Well, you have your cone-shaped soft lead. There's basically a small hollow chamber that allows the gases to expand, that allows for the faster trajectory. So is the hog fat really making things go any faster? Probably not.
But how did it explode? Was it just, why was it called that? Did it actually explode?
What's that?
The explosion. Explosive was showed in the previous slide. How did it like explode upon impact? Was it just like a main, like, oh.
Yeah,
this is-
exploded upon impact. Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the ladies. Women win wars, bottom line. This war, women served in every capacity on both sides in the Confederacy and the Union on the home front.
What's for mine?
Remember that in the North, everything is pretty much being retooled for the war effort. Women are serving and working in those factories. Even though there's a little bit of a slowdown for the union movement, women are still part of that union movement. Women are still trying to push forward for the right to vote, even though the war kind of stifles that. Some women will pose as men to fight in the military on both sides. In the Union Army, Sarah Emma Edmonds served as Frank Thompson. Obviously, women start to come into new roles. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell becomes our first female doctor in the U.S. Clara Barton, field nurse for the Union Army, founder of the American Red Cross. Dorothea Dix elevated nursing to a professional level, also an advocate for disabled individuals and the mentally ill who were institutionalized. Do keep in mind that a lot of soldiers are going to suffer from PTSD after this war as well. It just wasn't wasn't diagnosed, exactly. Dr. Mary Walker becomes the first female surgeon in the United States. She helped soldiers on both sides. She received the Congressional Medal of Honor, only woman to receive the honor from the American Civil War. Captain Sally Tompkins, she ran the Roberts Hospital, which we're going to try to take a look at the Roberts Hospital when we're out and about on our trip this spring. Jefferson Davis granted her a commission. She's the only woman to hold rank in the Confederacy. So here we have Clara Barton on the left and Sally Tompkins on the right. So we'll take a look at some of the battle tactics. And I feel like we've covered most of this. Remember that the battle tactics that they learned most of these guys had picked these battle tactics up from West Point. Do keep in mind that there are two things that advance faster than the tactics, and that is going to be advancements in technology and advancements in medicine are going to move far faster than the advancements in battle tactics. We will see a change in the battle tactics by the end of the war. Do keep in mind, medicine couldn't keep up with the technology. Most of the Napoleonic tactics taught at West Point were what were used on the field. Killing box at 50 yards, volley fired open in mass, shoulder to shoulder, followed by bayonet charge. And do keep in mind, too, that the rifled musket that is going to be used in this war with the mini ball, Springfield, is going to be too advanced for this style of tactics. Cavalry was used for flight movements. By the end of the war, we're going to see trench-style warfare and a brand new use of modern warfare tactics on both the western and eastern fronts. Artillery underwent major technological changes. We go from light 12-pound cannon with a range of 1,600 yards to cannon with, like siege cannon and field cannons with longer yardage, but also more lightweight and easier to get from place to place. This is an example of where warfare changes, and that is the siege of Fort Donelson. That's where we start to see some major changes in tactics. And that was where Grant takes Fort Donelson in 1862. Civil War weaponry, just want to break some of this down. We have knives, swords, firearms, handguns, rifled muskets, breech loaders, repeating weapons, field guns. Going to kind of break those down. Obviously, this is considered a modern war, all right? It is one that starts with a rifled musket and it ends with a machine gun, all right? It is one that starts with a wooden sloop and ends with an ironclad.
Did anybody actually use swords in combat? Or was that
Yes.
just family?
Yes. Cavalry used swords. People that ran out of bullets used swords. But do keep in mind that like 5% of your wounds in the entire war were inflicted by either swords or bayonets. So that number is pretty low when you think about it. Cavalry would have been your people using the swords. But by the end of the war, like by 1863 and 1864, where these cavalry battles got more intense, they dismounted and fought like infantrymen by the end of the war. So like these gallant cavalier charges, they're going to be a thing of the past by the end of the war. By the middle, yeah.
In the beginning of the war, what if we actually think somebody would just like sit on a horse, like that so everyone just go up hacking at it?
Oh, yeah. That was definitely happening, especially with the flanking movements. All right, so this is the most popular revolver on the Union side, and if the Confederates could get their hands on them or reproduce them on the Confederate side, and that is the Colt revolver, 44 caliber revolver, 6-shot revolver. You could even screw a stock onto the base of the handle to turn it into sort of a rifle. They also had a function where you could store liquor and other cartridges in the handle as well. This is also going to be tremendously popular moving into the post-war era and the era of Reconstruction, especially out in the West. It's going to be used by a lot of cowboys during the cowboy era. There's a famous quote. There's a famous quote by an African-American cowboy, and I have to look his name up, but he said, Abraham Lincoln may have freed the slaves, but Samuel Colt made us equal. All right. So this is a popular Confederate revolver. This is the Lamotte revolver. It's a French-style revolver. 42 caliber ball was reproduced throughout the Confederacy. Remember, our major weapons producer in the South is going to be Tredegar. You also have other factories. You got Fayetteville, North Carolina, Danville, Virginia, Birmingham, Atlanta, Harper's Ferry when it was in Confederate hands. This is kind of wild. 42 caliber ball on top, 16 gauge shell shot or buckshot on the bottom. Very interesting revolver that was widely used by the Confederacy.
How did you load that?
Same as you would have used with this particular situation. Like same with the Colt, like you would put up in the chamber and you load your bullets, and then you would load your shot, your buckshot, the shotgun section, like you loaded, musket at that time. All right, 1853 Enfield. The Enfield is a very popular rifle that is going to come to the United States from England. Popular on both sides. This is like the second most widely used infantry weapon. It fired a 577 caliber mini type. This is the most popular weapon. You might want to take note of this. I believe this is on your review. It is the Springfield Model 1861. It's the most widely used shoulder arm during the Civil War. And it is going to be reproduced in Richmond and in Fayetteville. These are the Confederate copies of the Springfield model. This was the go-to rifle for cavalrymen. This is the Sharps rifle. It is a carbine version, very popular with cavalry on both sides. This is the Burnside carbine. This is a breech-loading carbine, patented by Ambrose Burnside. Probably should have stuck to coastal defenses and inventing rifles. This is the Tarpley carbine. This is a very popular Confederate breech-loader, sort of comparable to the Sharps.
What do you mean by, like, how would they breech loader if it's not a self-contained metallic cartridge?
Because it could be loaded. It depended on the breakdown. It breaks down, load, or load to the bottom. Depends on the style. I've never fired a Tarpley, so I don't know what that. I fired a Sharps carbine before. Never fired a Tarpley. It's not like a lever action. Still two hammers. Does that make sense?
But is it a metallic cartridge? Like,
I don't know on the Tarpley. That's what it looks like. You want to look that up? I've never actually laid my hands on a Tarpley, nor have I fired one. This is one that I would really like to fire at some point. This is the prized possession of any person on either side of the war by the end of the war, and this is the Henry rifle. This is the precursor to the Winchester lever action. Yeah, I've seen them. I've had my hands on them, but I've never fired one. It is a volcanic repeating. It was manufactured by Volcanic Repeating Arms Company. Highly prized, very difficult to get a hold of. A lot of these guys purchased these with their own money, and a lot of the cavalry units, partisans, groups like that, they purchased them for their men. And then we have the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun, which was the gun to end the war, didn't really end the war because, well, it was not really all that popular in the field. 58 caliber rapid fire repeating gun. This is the precursor to the machine gun. 300 rounds per minute. One person in particular that had a good time with this gun was Lincoln. He tried to test all types of weaponry when it was introduced to the Army, and Gatling wrote to Lincoln, Richard Gatling wrote to Lincoln personally to say, I've got this invention that will end the war. Again, it didn't have a problem with overheating. It did have a problem jamming. So just what didn't see a whole lot of action in the Civil War. It sees more action in the post-war era. It's used pretty frequently in the Western Indian Wars. This is another interesting invention during the war. It's called the Ketchum grenade. Kind of looks like sort of what we would refer to as a German potato masher. But the problem with the Ketchum grenade, and the Confederacy had the Rains and Adams grenades, was that you throw the grenade, you have to have that plunger go down on the end. So if you throw it, it's kind of like the problem with the potato mashers. If it goes in handle first, then you're just creating a landmine, right? Because you might end up stepping on that, it might explode. So the Ketchum Rains and Adams weren't widely used, but again, a modern war, a war that by the end of it, we've got hand grenades. As I said, major advancements in artillery throughout the war. The most recognized artillery piece would be the 12-pound Napoleon bronze. How many people have ever seen, like if you're going down Monument and you see like cannons that are mounted? Most of those are Napoleons. I'll show you an example of a Napoleon 12-pounder when we're out and about in Richmond. 12-pound howitzers, 24-pound howitzers, the 10-pound Parrot's rifled cannon, the 3-inch ordnance, these are like the big guns, the ordnance guns, 20-pound Parrot, this is a massive muzzle-loading cannon, 12-pound Whitworth, it's a breech-loading rifled cannon. Keep in mind that when we talk about pounder, cannon does not weigh that much. That is the weight of the projectile. So you've likely seen this cannon. There's one or two on Monument. If you've ever visited VMI, I know a couple of you have popped in there. They're all over post. That's the Whitworth. I don't know if you've ever, might be a Whitworth somewhere in Richmond. I don't know. Do a little research. These are the big boys. That's the muzzle-loading Parrot. That would be what would we consider a gun, like a artillery, like at Fort Darling, at Drury's Bluff. All right. So we're going to wrap things up, talk about prisoners of war today. POWs, there's no initial plan or even a lasting plan for exchange of prisoners at the beginning of the war. So exchanges did occur early on. As the war goes on, more prisoner exchanges occur, but you start to see more like trading officers for officers. It becomes more scarce for the average enlisted man. Inhumane and severe treatment of prisoners or sympathetic civilians. Retaliatory actions on both sides. Grant established a strategy, no release to fight again. Confederacy took 195,000 Union prisoners of war. Union took 215,000 Confederate prisoners. 20 major POW camps and prisons in both the U.S. and the Confederate side. I don't know if you realize this, but the American Civil War and the treatment of prisoners of war helped inspire the first Geneva Convention in Switzerland in 1864. The next image is pretty disturbing. It's from Andersonville. That's how emaciated some of these POWs were that were starved to death. This man was barely alive. I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure. That's a really good question. Prisoner of war camps, hastily built, temporarily built, or they believe they would be temporary. Not intended for prison use. Andersonville's a good example of that. Like the water source that ran through Andersonville was also used as a latrine. So these guys were dying at alarming rates of dysentery. Poor locations. Obviously, the conditions were especially horrible in the South. Shortages of food, typically on both sides. Sanitation, non-existent or poor at best. Disease spread quickly with devastating consequences. No barracks or real permanent shelters. A lot of tents and rough structures for cover. Prisoners mostly slept on the ground. So your fortifications, old forts, former jails, prisons, warehouses, old businesses, former training facilities, camps, stockades, islands reused. Here's a legend of some of your Confederate and Union camps throughout the North and South. We have 2 that are in Richmond. So your Union prison camps, Fort McHenry, Maryland, Fort Delaware State Penitentiary in Alton, Illinois, Columbus, Ohio, Elmira, New York, which they called Helmira, Camp Douglas in Chicago, Rock Island, Illinois, Camp Chase in Ohio, Old Capitol Prison in D.C. The most severe of them all, well, not Helmira was bad, but also Point Lookout, Maryland. Officers Prison in St. Louis. This is the Old Capitol Prison in D.C. This is Camp Douglas in Chicago. Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio. This is a monument to Confederate soldiers that were buried in the enclosure there at Camp Chase. Rock Island, Illinois. Elmira, it rivaled the death rate of Andersonville. Andersonville's death rate was 28%. Elmira was 24%. 2,963 of the just over 12,000 prisoners died, mostly housed in tents, sub-zero temperatures, poor sanitation, scant clothing. Do y'all know what these barrels are called? They're actually meant to they're meant to humiliate. A lot of times they're called bankruptcy barrels. Yeah, they would force them to wear these barrels around to humiliate them. There's also kind of weird things that occurred in the prison camps, like they would take lice and heat up a tin and set the lice down in the tin, and they would have these races with the lice. They'd have rat races in the prisons. Yeah.
Arms are restricted, or?
Yeah, they just make them walk around with barrels and clothes on. Those guys had pants on. These are some images of Elmira. Point Lookout in Maryland. This is the largest POW camp. 50,000 Confederate enlisted men were held there. There's only a capacity for 10,000. Poor water, scarce food, cold temperatures. Your soldiers at Point Lookout. That's what Point Lookout, that's a sketch of Point Lookout there. Probably the warden's headquarters. I'll look that up for you now to double check. And then we've got some major Confederate prisons: Salisbury, North Carolina, Libby Prison in Richmond, Belle Isle, Tredegar in Richmond, Castle Thunder in Richmond, which was actually used for officers, Danville Prison in Danville, Virginia, Castle Pinckney and Charleston, and then Andersonville, Georgia. So here we have Danville, the officers' prison.
The officers and prisoners treated any better?
Yes, hands down. Castle Pinckney. This is Belle Isle, so we see the look from Tredegar. See all the tents out of Belle Isle. And then something to think about if you ever go down to Belle Isle. Here on the left we have the tents, and there on the right are just mass graves at Belle Isle of soldiers. I think a lot of those soldiers were actually, the bodies were moved. I don't know if all of them were. I have to take a look at that. Castle Thunder contained spies, political prisoners, some officers, harsh conditions, guards were brutal. Castle Thunder. Libby Prison, Union officer location.
Is that where like current location is?
Yeah, well, I'll show you where the location was when we go downtown. You know where, like, the canal, like close to the Holocaust Museum, the canal is? That's where it was located. There's Libby Prison.
Were there any cases of people escaping?
Yeah, there were prison breaks, for sure. Andersonville, really never intended to hold over 10,000. At its peak had 33,000, covered about 26.5 acres. No sanitation. In fact, their water, the Stockade Creek, was not only ran through the camp, but it was just completely filled with human waste. Prisoners starved to death. Death rate of 28%. Captain Henry Wirtz, the commandant and warden of this prison, was the only Confederate convicted of war crimes and executed after the war. 45,000 men entered Andersonville. 12,912 died at Andersonville. There's Henry Wirtz. Had a little version of Taps there. Stop playing. This is what the living conditions looked like at Andersonville. This is, you can go down there and visit. It's got some lean-tos. Kind of have you see what it was like for these Union prisoners living there. This is what the location looks like today. Sort of dug out into the ground here with these lean-tos. Here are the trenches in which bodies were buried. And these, again, emaciated POWs. And these are the graves at Andersonville. Go as far as the eye can see.